everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys my end of June wrap up, so I will be talking about all the books that I read from about the 16th of June to the very end. If you're interested in what I have to say about the books that I read in the first half of June, definitely check out my mid-month wrap up. I'll link it up in the cards above. I think I have about 10 or 11 books to talk about today, so without further ado, let's just get into it. First book I want to talk about is Ghosts of the Shadow Market by Cassandra Clare, Sarah Rees Brennan, Maureen Johnson, Kelly Link, and Robin Wasserman. So I read Chain of Gold this month, and I knew before jumping into that book that I wanted to read specifically the first two novellas in this bind-up because they have to do with characters from the Last Hour series. So the first one, I believe, is Cast Long Shadows, and here's, I don't know how much you can tell, but this is the beautiful picture for that novella. And this one essentially centers around Matthew Fairchild, and there is a very traumatic event that he ends up being the cause of. That's essentially the plot of this novella. I loved it so much. Also, these novellas were definitely a reread for me. I read almost all of these novellas in this bind-up back in January of 2019, but I wanted to reread them so that I could remember everything going into Chain of Gold. But yeah, Cast Long Shadows I gave 4.5 stars. I loved it so much. The other novella in this bind-up that I read was Every Exquisite Thing, which is specifically about Anna Lightwood, who I think is my favorite character in the Last Hour's crew. I'm going to talk about Chain of Gold in a minute, but I really wish that she would have been a more central character in that book. I feel like she was more of a featured slash side character, and I just think she's a better character than that. I think she deserves more page time, but this novella that I read as part of the bind-up is about her discovering that she loves dressing up as a man. And there's also a really sweet romance thrown in. And then at the very end of this novella, I loved it so much because Anna went to speak to her parents, and her parents already knew about her, and they just love and accept her for it. And I think at the very end, they were planning on like buying more clothes for her so that she didn't have to keep borrowing her younger brother's clothes, and it was just like such a sweet ending. Next up, I have The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This of course is an American classic. It was written in 1982. For some reason I thought that this was written in like maybe the 60s or the 50s. It's just one of those books that is so popular in our culture that I thought it was a much older book. And for those of you guys that don't know what this is about, this centers around Celie and Nettie. They are two sisters in rural Georgia, and they end up getting separated pretty early on in life, and their lives take very different paths. And this is essentially letters between the two of them, and it's also letters from Celie to God. This is a very powerful story. I definitely recommend it. I personally gave it 4 stars just because I think there was something about the writing style that I didn't feel like I could fully emotionally connect to the characters, if that makes sense. I mean, it's definitely still a story in a book that I fully appreciate, but it didn't emotionally impact me as much as I thought it was going to. All right, so next I'm going to talk about Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. This is book 1 in the Last Hour series, which is the book that I just referenced a couple minutes ago when I was talking about Ghosts of the Shadow Market. So this series centers around the children of the main characters in the Infernal Devices trilogy. And again, this is all a part of Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunter Chronicles universe, if you didn't already know. And this takes place in the Edwardian era. It's like 1902, 1903-ish. And I really enjoyed this. I also gave this 4 stars. I absolutely adore literally pretty much all of the characters in this series, and I already knew that going into this because of the novellas. They did a really good job of introducing all of the characters in those little novellas, so I knew that I already really loved their characters, but just seeing them all in action in this book and seeing all of like the messy romantic plot lines and different things like that, it was just so fun to read about. The reason why I didn't give this a higher rating, however, is that as amazing as the characters are, I just feel like the plot didn't quite measure up to the level of the characters, if that quite makes sense. I definitely feel like the Infernal Devices, for instance, has a much stronger plot than this first book, Of course, this is only the first book in the trilogy, so I'm sure things are going to change a lot with the second and the third book. But just with this first book alone, you know, the plot didn't really kick in until about page 200, which is kind of understandable because Cassandra Clare has to establish all these relationships between these characters. I mean, there are a ton of main characters in this book. I want to say there's probably like 10 major characters. I mean, there's kind of a lot going on with this book. But anyways, when the plot did finally kick in, it wasn't anything that really blew me away. I just feel like Cassandra Clare is capable of better plots. I don't know, and I just wanted better for these characters, and I think it just kind of lacked an originality to it. There's elements of this plot that I feel like I've read before in other Shadowhunter books. So yeah, I enjoyed it, gave it 4 stars, but unfortunately it is not a new favorite of mine. So the next book I'm going to talk about is You Are Not Alone by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. This is an author duo that I already knew that I really enjoyed their books. I read The Wife Between Us and An Anonymous Girl, and I was so excited when I got sent this book from NetGalley to review. So this is kind of a weird plot to describe. I mean, most thrillers are weird to describe, and I don't want to say too much because I really want you guys to go in as blind as possible. But all you need to know is that this takes place in New York City, and it centers around this woman, Shay. So essentially one day she's waiting for the subway and she sees this woman literally jump onto the tracks in front of a subway, and she ends up committing suicide that way. And so obviously that's a very traumatic experience for anyone to witness. And then she ends up becoming friends with these women that were friends with the woman that committed suicide. And it kind of turns into this whole like revenge cult thing. That's really all I want to say about the plot. I really enjoy this. Personally, I think this is the best book that they've written yet. I'm giving it a very solid 4 stars. I thought the pacing was really well done. The characters were very interesting. I did think that the plot of this was pretty unique and interesting. So next up, I read Pucked by Helena Hunting. This is a hockey romance series. I think there's at least like 6 or 7 books in this series, and they're essentially all standalone rom-coms, but the characters of all of these books are interconnected essentially. And this one centers around Alex Waters. He is a professional hockey player, and Violet's stepbrother is on the same team as Alex, so that's how Violet and Alex meet. And this is just a very smutty hockey rom-com. You know, if you're into that kind of thing, I would definitely recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. What I really did appreciate about this book is how weird and quirky Violet and Alex were together, and Violet especially is a very weird and kind of odd person. She's definitely like a socially awkward kind of person, so if you want to read a romance that centers around kind of weird people, I would definitely recommend this. It was a fun time. Alright, so the next book I'm going to discuss, I feel so conflicted about. It makes me really sad because it's a sequel that I've been looking forward to reading for months and months since it came out in January, and that is A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Brigid Kemmerer. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. For those of you guys that don't know, this is the sequel to A Curse So Dark and Lonely, which was literally one of my top favorite books of 2019. So needless to say, I was very excited going into this book. So this book, first of all, it centers around Gray, who was a major character in the first book, but I don't think he had his own POV, but if he did, it's not that notable because it was definitely more like Ren and Harper's story, whereas this book is definitely all about Gray, and it's also all about Liamara, who is the daughter of the queen of a country that Emberfall is fighting. So it's kind of centered around the idea of war. It's definitely not a war-centered book. I don't know. I definitely don't want to go too far into the plot of this because I do not want to spoil anything having to do with the first book or this book. But I just felt like, kind of similar with Chain of Gold, this had a kind of lackluster plot. If you've read this book and you read the first book, I think you'll agree with me that not a ton of important events happen in this book. I don't know, there was just kind of a lot of traveling happening and not a lot of major events, and it's really hard to explain. And as much as I enjoyed the romance between Gray and Liamara, yeah, the plot just didn't do it for me, and I was definitely kind of disappointed. Also, Brigid Kemmerer, why did you have to make me hate Ren in this book? I came to despise him, even at the very end when I could tell Brigid Kemmerer was trying to kind of redeem his character for us. Like, I hate him now, which is also very disappointing because I loved him so much in the first book. So very conflicted, as you can tell. I am still very excited to read the third book. So the next book I want to discuss is Under Rose-Tainted Skies by Louise Gornall. This is about Nora. This is a YA contemporary, and she has agoraphobia, OCD, and anxiety. So there is a lot of neurodiversity going on in this book. And there is this new guy, Luke, who moves into the house next door to her. And so this book is essentially all about her living with her mental disabilities as well as falling in love with this really sweet guy, Luke. But yeah, the romance was really, really sweet between these two characters. I gave this 4.5 stars. It was pretty close to being a 5-star for me because I just loved the representation. I loved being in Nora's mind the entire time. It's a very well-paced book as well. But I do think that the characters could have used more depth, maybe. I don't know. So I'm a little conflicted about that, and that's why I couldn't quite give it a 5-star, but I do highly recommend it if you're looking for a YA contemporary with really good mental health rep. But yeah, this is just a really well done novel. I wholeheartedly recommend it. Next up, I want to discuss To Catch an Earl by Kate Bateman. This was an e-arc that I got off of NetGalley. This is book 2 in her Bow Street Bachelor series. So this is a historical romance that centers around Alex and Emmy. Alex is a Bow Street runner, which is essentially a police officer, and Emmy is a jewel thief. And so, as you can probably tell, this book has a lot of good actual enemies to lovers realness. I don't know how else to explain it. I loved the banter between these two characters because the whole book, they were both on to each other. You know, Emmy knew that he was a Bow Street runner, and Alex knew that she was this infamous jewel thief. And so most of this book is like a game of cat and mouse, and that was a lot of fun. But yeah, their banter and chemistry was just so good. The only kind of negative I have about this book is that there were times where I felt like the pacing could have been better. It was a little slow at times, and I do think that this book could have used a little bit more romance and a little bit less of like the jewel thief plot, but that's just, I guess, my personal preference. My first Kate Bateman book definitely did not disappoint. I'm really excited to read not only the first book in this series, but the third book, which is coming out in December. I have an e-arc of that one as well. Next up, I want to talk about All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. So this is a YA memoir by George M. Johnson about his life. In my book haul where I talked about this book, I said that George is non-binary. That is not the case. I don't know where I got that information in my mind, but George definitely identifies as a man. He is Black and queer. So he talks about his life experiences from being a very young child to adulthood. Mainly, he kind of stops at around college age. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I did really enjoy it. There is fantastic representation. If you are Black or queer, I think that you will get a lot more out of this book than I did. I mainly read these memoirs to just be a more well-rounded reader, to kind of listen to stories from perspectives that are very different from my own. But I do think if you are someone that relates to George, you will absolutely love this memoir. Also, I do want to say that there is a content warning for sexual assault in this, so just be aware of that before going into it. I think that anyone would learn a lot from this memoir. I definitely did. All right, guys, last but not least, I have 2 5-star reads to talk about, which is always so exciting. So the first one I'm going to touch on is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Oluo. So, I mean, you can probably tell from the title, and I also talked about this book a bit in my last book haul. If you want to watch that video, I'll link it up in the cards above. But this book centers around a lot of different racial issues in only about 250 pages, and I think Ijoma did a fantastic job of just being so succinct and so to the point. And I love that she also brought in like autobiographical elements. Like, she brought in elements from her own life experience into talking about all of these different issues. For instance, I'm just going to look at the table of contents. She talks about intersectionality, why am I always being told to check my privilege, police brutality, why can't I use the N-word, what is the school to prison pipeline, what is cultural appropriation. I definitely learned a lot from this book. I put quite a few tabs in to kind of reference to later on, because I'm one of those people, when I read nonfiction, I do find it difficult to retain a lot of the knowledge just reading it one time. So so this is definitely a book that I'll want to revisit at some point. She does address people of color and Black people specifically, but she also addresses white people specifically. So yeah, I think anyone could learn a lot from this book. This is definitely the perfect place to start if you are someone that wants to start educating themselves and be a better ally and activist for racial justice. And last but not least, we're going to talk about The Devil of Downtown by Joanna Shupe. This is the third and final book in her Uptown Girls series. I did get an e-arc of this off of NetGalley, so that's the format that I read it in, but I just couldn't resist having a copy of my own because I love this historical romance series so much. So this centers around three sisters, and this one is about the youngest sister, Justine, and it takes place in the Gilded Age era in New York City. Justine is kind of a radical person in this time and place. She's devoted to tracking down deadbeat husbands and fighting for fair working conditions, among a lot of other things, like she works in soup kitchens and things like that. Then there's this guy, Jack Mulligan, who is like kind of like the king of the underground in New York City. They're kind of polar opposites, but I loved their chemistry and their romance so much. Also, I think that this book had the best smut of the entire series. It was just so good. Also, there was a lot of fun scenes, like they go bowling in the bowling alley at his house. Like, that's pretty awesome that he has his own bowling alley. Yeah, I could go on and on about this book and this series. I of course gave this one 5 stars. This whole series is definitely one of my favorite historical romance series. I highly recommend checking it out. Alright guys, that's going to be it for my end of June wrap up. I hope you guys enjoyed. I would also love it if you would leave a comment below if you want to discuss any of the books that I talked about in this video. I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!